Imagine surviving the horrors of Andersonville, the most brutal prisoner of war camp in American history. You are starving, skeletal, and broken, but the war is over. You are finally going home. You board a steamship built for 376 people, but the military packs it with over 2,100 souls. In the dead of night, on a flooded, dark Mississippi River, the boilers scream, and then the world turns into fire. More people died on the Sultana than on the Titanic, yet history has remained silent. This is the true story of the men who survived the fire, only to face the icy teeth of the Great Flood. Chapter 1: The Skeleton Army. The air in Vicksburg, Mississippi in April 1865 was thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy rot of a dying war. Private Silas Vance didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a ghost draped in blue rags, his ribs pressed against his skin like the hull of a wrecked ship. Having survived 14 months in the Confederate prison at Andersonville, Silas had learned that hope was more dangerous than a mini-ball. But today, hope was all he had. "Vance, get in line, we're moving out," the sergeant barked. Silas shuffled toward the docks. There she sat, the Sultana, a majestic side-wheel steamboat, her twin chimneys belching thick pine smoke into the gray sky. She was beautiful, but Silas noticed something odd. The ship was sagging, the waterline was dangerously high. Captain J. Cass Mason, the ship's master, paced the hurricane deck. He was in debt, desperate for the government's payout of $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer for their passage north. He had looked at the leaky boiler earlier that morning, a bulge the size of a man's head on the iron plating. A proper repair would take days. Chapter 2: The Boiling Heart. The Mississippi River was in a state of great flood. The banks had vanished, and the river was miles wide, a churning monster of cold, brown water filled with uprooted trees. As the Sultana fought the current, the strain on her boilers was immense. Because the ship was so top-heavy with soldiers, every time she turned, the water inside the boilers would slosh to one side. This left the red-hot iron plates on the other side exposed to nothing but steam. When the ship leveled out, the cold water would hit those searing plates. Silas lay on the deck near the middle of the ship, his head resting on his knapsack. Above him, the stars were hidden by a thick, oppressive mist. "You think we'll be in Cairo by morning, Silas?" his bunkmate, a boy named Henry, whispered. "By morning, Henry, we'll be in a land where there's no more gray uniforms and no more starvation," Silas replied, closing his eyes. At 2 a.m., 7 miles north of Memphis, the silence of the river was shattered. The center boiler, the one with the patch, could no longer hold the 150 psi of pressure. It exploded with the force of a modern bomb. The blast tore upward through the packed decks. Hundreds of men were killed instantly in their sleep, vaporized by the scalding steam or crushed by the collapsing smokestacks. Silas was thrown 30 feet into the air, landing on a pile of splintered wood. The Sultana didn't just break, she became a torch. Chapter 3: The Dark Water. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was not a scream. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, followed by the sound of rushing steam. Silas Vance lay on the splintered remains of the hurricane deck, his ears ringing. When his vision cleared, he saw the unthinkable. The center of the ship was gone. Where the majestic smokestacks had stood, there was now a jagged crater of fire. The blast had blown the heavy boilers upward and forward, shearing through the packed decks of sleeping men like a hot knife through wax. "Henry," Silas croaked, reaching out for his friend. But Henry was gone. In his place was a hole in the deck, and below it a furnace of orange flame. The Sultana was a wooden ship, seasoned by years of sun and soaked in oil and paint. It ignited like a tinderbox. The soldiers who had survived the blast now faced a choice that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. To stay on board was to be cremated alive. To jump was to enter a river that was 7 miles wide and freezing cold. Silas stood at the railing. The heat behind him was so intense it singed the hair on the back of his neck. Below him, the Mississippi looked like a churning pit of ink. Hundreds of men were already in the water, their white skin flashing like salt in the dark. They were screaming, splashing, and most terrifyingly, clinging to one another in their death throes. "Don't let 'em grab you," an officer shouted from the darkness. "If they grab you, they'll pull you under." Silas took a deep breath, clutched a loose. Chapter 4. The Grip of the River. The impact with the water felt like hitting a stone wall. The cold was so absolute it felt like fire. Silas's lungs seized, a natural reflex called the cold shock response, which forced him to gasp. Had his head been underwater, he would have drowned in seconds. He kicked frantically, his heavy wool uniform dragging him down like a suit of lead. He found his plank and hugged it to his chest. The Mississippi in April 1865 was a monster. Because of the Great Flood, the river had overflowed its banks, covering the surrounding forests and bayous. There were no lights on the shore, because there was no shore, only the tops of half-submerged willow trees miles away. Silas looked back at the Sultana. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. The ship was drifting downstream, a massive torch illuminating the silhouettes of men still jumping from the bow. Then the fire reached the remaining paddle box. With a sickening groan, the heavy timber structure collapsed into the water, sending a wave of sparks into the air. Suddenly, a hand gripped Silas's ankle. "Help, please," a voice gurgled. Silas looked down. It was a young boy, barely 18, his eyes wide with the madness of drowning. He was pulling Silas down. Silas knew that if he didn't break free, they would both die. It was the brutal mathematics of survival that the prisoners of Andersonville knew all too well. With a sob of guilt, Silas kicked out with his free leg, breaking the boy's grip. He paddled away into the darkness, the boy's cry. Chapter 5. The Heroes of the Shore. While the survivors struggled in the current, the city of Memphis, Tennessee was waking up to a nightmare. From the bluffs of the city, residents saw a glow on the northern horizon that looked like a second sunrise. The first alarm was raised by the crew of the Bostonia II. They saw the burning wreck drifting toward them and immediately began throwing lifeboats and cotton bales into the water for men to cling to. But the most incredible part of the Sultana's story is the civilians. Just weeks ago, Memphis had been a Confederate stronghold, and the men in the water were the Yankee enemies who had burned their lands. Yet as the sun began to rise, dozens of small skiffs and rowboats set out from the docks. Men who had lost sons to Union bullets now pulled shivering, half-dead Union soldiers from the water. Women on the shore tore up their own bedsheets to make bandages and brewed giant pots of coffee. For a few hours on that bloody April morning, the Civil War was over. There was only the brotherhood of the drowning and the saved. Chapter 6. The City of the Saved and the Dead. As dawn broke over Memphis on April 27th, the Mississippi River resembled a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. The current had carried survivors and corpses miles downstream. Some men were found miles inland, clinging to the tops of submerged trees in the flooded forests, their fingers frozen into the bark. Silas Vance was pulled from the water by 2 Tennessee fishermen. He was so hypothermic that his skin had turned a translucent blue, and he couldn't even whisper his own name. He was taken to the Gayoso Hospital, where the floors were already slick with the mud and blood of hundreds of his comrades. "Why?" Silas finally managed to croak as a nurse wrapped him in heated bricks and wool. "Why were there so many of us on that boat?" The nurse didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was far uglier than a simple accident. In the wards of Memphis, a grim realization began to settle. Of the 2,100 people on board, over 1,100 were gone. Families who had spent years praying for their sons to survive the war received a final cruel telegram. Survived the prison. Lost on the river. Chapter 7. The Paper Trail of Greed. While the survivors were being treated, a different kind of fire was burning in the military offices, the frantic burning of evidence. An investigation was launched immediately, and what it found was a staggering web of corruption. Captain J. Cass Mason of the Sultana had been a man on the brink of bankruptcy. He needed a full load to save his career. But he wasn't alone. Union Captain Frederick Speed and Colonel Reuben Hatch were the officers in charge of the prisoner exchange at Vicksburg. The government was paying a bounty for every soldier put on a ship. Evidence suggests that a kickback scheme was in place. Money passed under the table to ensure the Sultana was packed to the breaking point, while other ships nearby sat nearly empty. The boilers had screamed a warning in Vicksburg, but the officers had ignored it. The blacksmith who performed the patch job testified that he told the captain the boiler was a death trap. "I told them it wouldn't hold," the blacksmith whispered on the stand. "But they told me to get it done and get the men on board. There was money to be made."
Chapter 8. The Great Silence. In any other year, the Sultana would have been the headline of the century, but 1865 was the most crowded year in American history. Just 12 days before the explosion, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The nation was paralyzed by grief. On April 26th, the day before the Sultana went down, John Wilkes Booth was cornered and killed in a barn in Virginia. The telegraph lines were jammed with news of the hunt for conspirators and the funeral train of the president. When news of the 1,100 dead soldiers reached Washington, it was buried on the third or fourth page of the newspapers. To a public already numb to 4 years of slaughter, the Sultana was just another list of names in a sea of casualties. The government, embarrassed by the corruption in its own ranks, did little to keep the story alive. There were no grand monuments, no national days of mourning. The Sultana became the forgotten tragedy.
Chapter 9. The Ghost Association. Silas Vance returned home to a small farm in Ohio, but he never truly left the river. Every year on April 27th, he would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the phantom heat of the fire and the icy grip of the Mississippi. In the 1880s, the survivors began to find one another. They formed the Sultana Survivors Association. These men, skeletal veterans of Andersville, who had survived a fire that should have killed them, met every year to share a meal and read the names of the dead. They fought for decades to have a monument built. They fought to tell the world that their brothers hadn't died in combat, but because of a leaky boiler and a handful of bribes. Silas lived to be an old man. In his final days, he sat on his porch watching the sunset. He often said that he could still hear the sound of the paddle wheel and the final haunting scream of the boiler. In 1982, a researcher named Jerry Potter used archaeological techniques to find the wreck. Because the Mississippi had changed its course over a century, the Sultana wasn't in the water anymore. She was buried under 20 feet of soybean field in Arkansas, encased in the mud of the river that had claimed her. The Sultana remains the greatest maritime disaster in American history, a reminder that in the shadow of war, the greatest enemy is often not the one across the battlefield, but the greed within one's own soul. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments section. Your feedback is truly appreciated.